Welcome. I'm Amy Fennell with Louisiana Realtors, and today I have here with me Commissioner Rick Roberts.
Hello, good to be here.
We're discussing the new or the updated changes to the residential agreement to buy or sell. There will be a new version that will become mandatory come January 1st of 2019. The form is currently available on lrac.gov for download and use, but it won't be mandated till the first of the year. As a little bit of background, typically the process for changes or updates to the contract are done by a joined work group of Louisiana Realtors as well as Louisiana Real Estate Commission staff, commissioners, educators, and title attorneys in the industry who kind of get together and take the feedback that we solicit from you in the field to kind of go into what updates and changes are made to the form. This year, we did that process and had over 200 comments sent through and pulled the work group together. And as a result, the contract highlights what those updates and changes are. Rick, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, like you said, it's a bifurcated effort with Louisiana Real Estate Commission and Louisiana Realtors. We take all comments, we evaluate all of them, we take all suggestions throughout the year. I can tell you this: everything that's sent in is given its due consideration, and the changes that are made reflect those things that we get from those practitioners that are working out in the field, or if it's title attorneys that see something that we need to tweak or add, or if it's even something industry related, such as the last contract was very much driven by what TRID was in place with the CFPB and those sorts of things. So it's your document. It's a living, breathing document that is, in my opinion, one of the most important tools that we use. So it's always up for amending and changing as we change in our industry. So yes, it's a big effort with a lot of people involved. So and I'm proud of what we have.
Good. What we wanted to do today was go over the highlights of those updates, keeping in mind that throughout 2019, the mandatory CE topic will be on this particular form as well as other recommended addenda. With that, we'll get started. What you have on the screen before you is a copy of that contract dated 1/1/2019. We'll go along and highlight what those updates and changes are to the form. And we'll also be pulling up the new deposit addendum to review as well. So let's get started, Rick.
Okay, and again, this is part of your mandatory education for next year. So our goal here is maybe to give some insight on why maybe certain changes were made and how they came about. So anyway, first page, little formatting. Brokerage is now in place instead of firm or broker's name. That's the third line on either side. Again, just formatting, nothing really big to discuss there. Page 2 is where we kind of get into the meat of the changes. The first change that you'll see that's a little bit different and significant is under contingency for sale of buyer's other property. And in the past, it just referred to the C addendum, contingency clause addendum shall apply. What we did is added language found either in lines 301 or 307 or the attached addendum. And this was an effort for those of us out in the field who more often would like to just simply write into the additional terms whatever the contingency is, especially if it's a property that's already under contract. And using the addendum really didn't address that. We decided to make it a little bit easier. If one wanted to use the additional terms, it was referred to there in lines 301 and 307. Again, this was something we got from a lot of practitioners that we made change to. Hopefully you'll find that easier to use in case you do decide not to use the addendum for the contingency. So that's the biggest change on that particular page. If you drop down to the financing section, lines 65, we had a conventional mortgage. And keep in mind too, you can have multiple boxes checked here. For instance, it could be conventional mortgage fixed rate or conventional mortgage adjusted rate or owner financing fixed rate. It doesn't have to be just one box. It could be multiple boxes that would apply. So anyway, it just gave another option. Of course, you still have other, which is there. And in a little more formatting, we just took out a line on the other financing additions because we trying to, in an effort to maybe save some trees and reduce the pages, although we didn't really accomplish that. But that was the formatting on line 71. So anyway, let's get to the biggest change, which is page 3. And it's regarding the deposit. So in the past, if you recall in the current contract that we're using, deposit shall be delivered immediately. Well, there's been a lot of consternation and pushback on what the definition of immediately is. And my definition might be different from Amy's and might be different from many of yours out there. So in an effort to bring some clarity to this part of the contract, we pre-printed 72 hours. And the thought behind that is 72 hours would take into account weekends and a calendar day, which would be a weekday, to get a deposit to listing broker or to whoever it's going to. FedEx, mail perhaps, but hopefully that could be accomplished in 72 hours. Now, mind you, if 72 hours don't suit your needs, you can surely amend that in the additional terms and make it 4 days, 5 days, whatever you so desire. There was a lot of discussion. I was one of the ones who maybe suggested to put a blank there, and you could put a time and date there. But at the end of the day, 72 hours seemed the rule of the day, and that's what was put in line 109. The other salient change to the deposits, first the formatting, we included electronic transfer because now that is a widely held and used mechanism to get deposits. So we included that, electronic transfer. But if you drop to line 113, the deposit shall be held by. You can check one of 3 options: listing broker, selling broker, or third party. Now, the reasoning and rationale behind that is because it's been becoming in vogue for a lot of agents, brokerages, to have third parties hold deposits, whether it's a title company, it could be a builder, it could be anyone for that matter, it could be considered a third party. The rationale with this information, and we'll get to the box underneath it, and delineating who's holding the deposit was because us as licensees and realtors were not doing a good job of explaining what happens if a deposit's held by a third party. It's very clear what happens when a listing broker or selling broker holds a deposit, because there's rules that are in place that the Real Estate Commission put in place that those brokers must abide by. But if a third party's holding it, there are no rules. The check doesn't necessarily have to be negotiated. It could be held by that third party. It doesn't necessarily have to be put in a non-interest bearing account. It could be put in I mean, there's a lot of things there that we weren't informing the public of. So this was an effort to inform the public that if a third party holds it, this is what can and cannot happen. Now, I'm not saying, hey, Rick, Rick, I might want to have a title company hold it. Well, buyer and seller can opt and contract to have anybody they want hold it. This is just informed consent to both buyer and seller. So if you go down to the box underneath it, it explains pretty clearly and vividly what happens if a third party is holding the deposit. Let me take a step back for a second now. Brokerages are not mandated to have an escrow account. If they do not handle escrow funds, they're not required by Louisiana Real Estate Commission to have an escrow account. And that's totally understandable. So if you write a contract and the listing company does not have an escrow fund, you can have your company hold it. That's not a problem. The only time where we need some informed consent is a third party. So if you drop down to the box, it clearly explains what can and can't happen. And understanding that the Louisiana Real Estate Commission may not have jurisdiction, probably does not, over those third parties holding the funds. So buyer and seller would acknowledge that third parties holding it, and there's also a reference to have them read the attached addendum. Now, the attached addendum, and can we shift gears to that? Okay. Is we have one on the commission website that is a suggested addendum. Mind you, there's only 2 mandatory forms: contract or buy-sell agreement and the property disclosure. So the deposit addendum can be what you see on the commission website. It can be what your company has produced. It's okay. Whatever you choose to use is fine. But by signing in that box on the buy-sell agreement, they're acknowledging what can and can't happen with the deposit and that they've read the attached addendum, whatever that addendum may be that you use. So it also says that the broker is not legally required to disperse a security deposit in accordance with the revised statute when a third party holds a deposit. So the takeaway here is, hey, look, buyer and seller can contract to have anybody they want hold a deposit. If it's a third party, meaning somebody other than the listing broker or selling broker, they have informed consent. So that's probably the biggest change. If there's business models out there who always have third parties holding deposits, that's perfectly fine and okay. We're just informing the public, both buyer and seller, what can and cannot happen. So I'm sorry if I spent too much time on that, but that's the most salient part of the contract and the biggest change that we made on the buy-sell agreement. So I think that covered that, right, Amy?
I think so. One of the questions that did come up was if you are having the deposit held by the listing or selling broker and you aren't checking that third party box,
right,
then the signature lines on the bottom should just be filled out with not applicable.
Simply not applicable. That's correct. Okay, page 4 would be the next change that comes, and it's formatting again. But it's number 3 under the return of deposit to the buyer. And that is addressing if the seller declares the agreement null and void for failure buyer to comply with written document requirements as set forth in lines 80 through 85. So if the buyer cannot get verification from his lender's not cooperating, the seller can declare the contract null and void. However, they cannot keep the deposit. The deposit would get returned back to the buyer. That is a change that was made in accordance with the financing section. So that comes on page 4, number 3. We can skip down to Amy. We have some formatting throughout, nothing of great consequence until we get to, well, page 7. We added under the offender notification. You there? Okay. Flood hazard information. And again, this is just some informational purposes, information for buyers regarding flood information. They can go to the FEMA website if they want to pull up the flood zone of their property. This gives them the website to do it, along with offender notification and mold hazard related notices. So anyway, that was just another add-on to just protection for the buyer. Let's continue on to page 8. In the list of addenda, we added deposit held by addendum. So you can check that box if, again, the deposit checks in, you selected third party, you have buyer and seller sign in the box. You could check off deposit held by addendum, whichever addendum you so choose, and that way it's part of the contract and it's noted there. Of course, you have your typical blank spots as well. The final, I guess, salient biggest change comes on the last page, page 9, and it is addressing the email addresses for buyers and sales agent. Now, if you recall in the past, the lines had seller's agent email address, buyer agent email address, and seller and buyer email address. Well, that caused a lot of consternation out in the field. We didn't want to have agents with the ability to email the other agent's clients, and everybody was a little bit upset about that. I can tell you when we first put this change in back 2 years ago, this was in the throes of TRID, and we were trying to make it easier for title companies to correspond and deal with buyers and sellers. But it got askew. Nobody filled it out. Nobody used it. So we decided to simply take the seller and buyer off of there and just have seller's agent and buyer's agent email addresses, which makes sense. To further clarify that, lines 371 and 372 read, the authorization contained in this section is not an authorization for the buyer's agent to communicate directly with the seller or a seller's agent to communicate directly with the buyer. So if there was any confusion there, that should clear it up. That was not an intent for some agent to circumvent their other agent colleague and go directly to their principal. So that's reflected on lines 361 to 372 on the top of page 9. And then finally, yes, we took out the expiration of offer, binding and irrevocable through. You have, of course, date, time, AM, PM, noon. Part of the rationale for that is all time frames for the buy-sell agreement are Central Standard Times, and the day ends at 11:59 p.m. So if by some chance you're a night owl and you decided to want to have the contract expire at midnight, it wouldn't coincide with necessarily the expiration of time for our buy-sell agreement, which would be 11:59 p.m. So if you really had a penchant to make it good through the end of the night, then you would simply write in 11:59 and check PM. And then finally, if you recall, and again, it was a twofold effort here to maybe save a page on the contract and also get rid of another source of consternation, which was under the buyer and under the seller's information, we had street address, city and state, telephone number, work number, all those things that never got filled out. And again, was taken as an invitation to contact the other agent's client. So we conveniently took all that information off, and all you see reflected there is signature lines and then the print for buyer or seller. And again, it was an effort to help title companies so they wouldn't have to call licensees to say, hey, give me your buyer's information. But of course, nobody filled it out. So we simply took it off. That pretty much covers the bulk of the changes. Again, there's some formatting things here and there. A lot of what we went over was taken directly from licensees and title attorneys, for that matter, who just saw that there were some things needed to be changed that would make our life a little bit easier. Again, the biggest thing would be the third parties holding deposits, which there's no prohibition to do, but this is just informed consent for buyer and seller on the contract that they will ratify by signature and an addendum. What happens if? So, what questions did we have, Amy? Any other questions that we discovered along the way? We had a lot of input on a lot of different things. I can tell you by far the bulk of the comments we got in were regarding the deposit. Is that fair to say?
I think so.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. If there are still additional questions or things like that that you would like clarification on, particularly with this document, we'll certainly provide you with all the information and links to be able to answer that. And we'll try to, get the best answer that we can for that. But I think, kudos to the work group and everybody who has put the hours and the time in to review all those comments and discuss them in detail and figure out what's the best way to change that so that we're all working from the same document.
And again, this is your document, and we take the input that we get, especially from practitioners and licensees, very seriously. We take it all into consideration. This is your document. This is our one tool that is the most valuable tool in our box, if you will, because we're all using the same document and reading and going over. So again, if there's any questions, comments, we take them all the time, even though it might not be a year that we make changes. We memorialize all those, and when it comes time to take that into account, we do. And again, some of the changes are industry driven or whatever is happening out in the field that we see that needs to be changed, or we get some input, we'll make those changes.
Great. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.